Okay, welcome and thank you for joining us. Again, my name is Laura Bryant at the Merowitz Center. We always have lots of fun, interesting, and fun programs, but I'm pretty sure today is the first time we have focused on a doll. This afternoon's program is Barbie and Ruth, and our guest speaker is historian and best-selling author Robin Gerber, who wrote the book Barbie and Ruth, the story of the world's most famous doll and the woman who created her. Robin has been senior faculty for the Institute for Management Studies, where she's taught a popular course on authentic leadership. In addition, she is a former senior fellow at the Gallup Organization and at the James McGregor Burns Academy of Leadership at the University of Maryland. Thank you, Robin, for sharing your expertise and your research. We're all looking forward to hearing about Ruth Handler, a Jewish stenographer who reinvented herself as an extraordinary entrepreneur and co-founded Mattel toy company in 1945. That is some second act. So thank you and welcome, and let's go.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for joining this in your afternoon there in Central Time. I'm on the West Coast in a little town called Ojai, California, in Southern California, not far from where Mattel was founded, of course, in Los Angeles. As Laura said, I wrote this book, Barbie and Ruth, which is the first and only biography, other than a children's one, I think, of Ruth Handler. And it did pretty well when it came out from Harper in 2009. But then the recent phenomena of the movie happened, and I spent a good month of the summer answering interview requests, and really sort of brought the book to the fore again. It even reappeared in bookstores, which was a real shocker because you rarely see a book that's as old as Barbie and Ruth in stores. But of course it holds up because it's the story from birth to death of Ruth Handler, who was the 10th and last child of Polish Jewish immigrants. And so I think of hers as the great American Jewish entrepreneurial story. I'm Jewish myself. I grew up in Skokie and Illinois. And my mother was born the same year as Ruth Handler, and also from immigrant parents and working class people. So I felt very close to the story. I used to think, well, gee, my mother could have been Ruth Handler, but she wasn't. Ruth was a very special person. I do have, rather than a PowerPoint, after I wrote Barbie and Ruth, about 10 years later, Mattel asked me to do a tabletop book. They do these every 10 years, every decade. And this was the 60th anniversary book. Does anyone have one? If you do, you can raise your hand. They're limited edition. And so I'm afraid you can't really buy one now, except for hundreds of dollars on eBay or something. But I can show you some pictures from it. And one of the fun things about it, since I'd already written the biography, was that I was allowed to go into the Mattel archives. And there I found some really wonderful pictures that hadn't been seen before. And also I found out information about Barbie, which I'll tell you that I hadn't known. Anyway, to start at the beginning with Ruth, she was the 10th and last child of Polish Jewish immigrants. Her father had escaped from Polish-Russian border area. The Tsar was conscripting him into the army, where he didn't want to go. Plus he was a man who loved to gamble. And the story is he had quite a lot of gambling debts that were trailing after him as he got out of the old country and landed at Ellis Island, got shipped off to Denver because he had experience shoeing horses, and they needed people to work on the railroad. His wife followed a few years later. Neither of them really ever spoke English that well. They spoke Yiddish. And when Ruth came along, when Ruth was born, they lived in a very Jewish, like a shtetl in Denver, very Jewish area. When Ruth came along, really her mother was too ill to take care of her. She just was overworked with the other kids. And so her first child, Sarah, was about 20, 21, had just gotten married. And so her mother gave Ruth to her to take care of for a short period of time. And Ruth never came back to her parents' household. So she was raised by Sarah. Sarah, just in a quirk of fate, could not have children herself. So Ruth, her sister, really became her only child. And Ruth loved her dearly. They were very, very close. But Sarah was a working woman. There was a big public market in Denver, and her husband sold liquor there illegally and eventually legally. And she ran a diner counter, diner kind of thing. And I actually found a picture of Ruth when she would have been about 14, working the cash register there. I think she was a little girl very much in a hurry to grow up, a little girl who wanted to be a big girl. And of course, that figures very largely in her story. And so she is in Denver, goes to a B'nai B'rith dance where the boys would ask you to dance and they'd have to pay a dime. That's how the B'nai B'rith was raising money, I guess. And this very cute boy she'd seen around town asked her to dance. His name was Izzy Handler. And he also had immigrant parents, but they didn't do as well as Sarah, her Ruth's sister mother. And so he lived in kind of not as nice a part of town, but also a very Jewish part of town. He had a ripped T-shirt. She remembered this. And she said, from the moment they touched on the dance floor, they were in love. This was really love at first sight, first touch. They were inseparable. Sarah was beside herself. She did not want Ruth to marry this boy. She felt he had no good prospects. He wanted to be an artist. And she just envisioned them living in some attic, some garret somewhere, and never having anything. But there was no separating them. She tried. She sent Ruth off to Los Angeles for a summer. And all that happened was that Ruth fell in love with Los Angeles. She thought the weather was a whole lot better than Denver. And she insisted that she would marry Elliot. And so they did. And they jumped in their car after the wedding. She had a brother who ran a car dealership, and he gave her a car. They were a very close family. Her name was Moscow. That was her name before she married Elliot. She jumped in the car with Elliot, and they drove. If you look at a map from Denver to LA, you'll see that there's quite a bit of desert that you get to drive over. And so she's driving through the desert with Izzy. She turns to him and she says, when we get to LA, it's going to be a new life, and I don't want you to call yourself Izzy anymore, because there's a great deal of anti-Semitism. I'm sorry, I didn't tell you the year we're in. She was born in 1916. So now it's late 1930s, 1936 or so. And there's a great deal of anti-Semitism in the country, as I'm sure you all know. And she had experienced it. She'd been stopped by a police officer in Denver with her brother, whose name was Muzzy, also a nickname of a very Jewish name. And the officer started making fun of him and threatening them. So she was worried about anti-Semitism. She said, your middle name's Elliot. Let's call you Elliot. And because he always did what Ruth said, when I interviewed him, he said, I always did what Ruthie said. He agreed. So that's how we got Elliot Handler. And of course, they were married. So Ruth and Elliot Handler. They get to Los Angeles. She takes a job as what they called then secretaries. Some of you remember secretaries at Paramount Pictures. And he goes to art school and he starts making things. She hates it at Paramount. She thinks they have no idea what they're doing. They're terribly inefficient. She has this natural head for management and business. But Elliot is making these beautiful pieces. He's making bookends and ashtrays and, as they did at the time, little jewelry you could wear, like a little vase you could pin on your shirt and put a flower into it. And she thinks these are brilliant, because everything Elliot did was brilliant. And she packs up an old suitcase with his creations, and at her lunch break at Paramount, she marches into a very fancy store on Wilshire Boulevard in LA and says, "Why don't you buy some of these?" And Mr. Zako, who owned the store, says, "These are great. I will buy them. Can I come to your factory?" Well, their factory was an old Chinese laundry that was really quite a mess. But she said she walked out of making that sale and felt like she'd taken drugs. She couldn't have been more excited. And so that really was the beginning of them building an entrepreneurial partnership and a business. So I'll fast forward here a little bit. I won't get into the details unless you're interested. We'll have plenty of time for questions of how she managed to also get Elliot, out of having to serve all of his time in the army because she needed him for running the business. And after World War II, of course, there was a tremendous need for toys. All these soldiers were coming back, getting married, as we know. It was the baby boom was about to boom, exactly. And so Elliot, because during the war, materials were very restricted, Elliot had scraps of wood to work with and some new materials in the plastics area. And he started making dollhouse furniture because he just loved toys. And Ruth, again, thought they were wonderful. And she found that she could sell, that there was a market for them. So that was the original beginning, the very, very beginning of what became Mattel. Now you're thinking, how did they get that name? And why isn't Ruth's name part of that name? Well, she wasn't very happy about that. But the way it happened was when they started the business, they brought in an investor. And his name was Harold Matson. And he gave $10,000 to be part of this new company with them. And he and Elliot decided that they'd combine their names, Matt and Elliot, Mattel. And Ruth said later, "I don't know why I agreed to that. It didn't have my name anywhere in there, and it should have, because I was one of the founders standing there with them." Well, really, she ran the company. And Harold Matson and Elliot were fabricating. Elliot was coming up with the ideas. Harold was the one who knew how to fabricate what they were making. And they made their first toy. It was a it was a musical toy. Elliot loved music. And it was a sort of clever ukulele, because Arthur Godfrey, anyone remember him? He was very popular, played the ukulele. So they made a toy ukulele. And it was imitating what he played. They put it in a beautiful box. It was their first toy. And everyone said to Ruth, "You don't sell the toy anywhere until Toy Fair in March. And then you unveil the toy at Toy Fair and you get orders from the companies." But she, of course, knew better than everybody else and decided that she could sell it around the country ahead of Toy Fair, and that would give her a head start. So she found some sales reps around the country. They sold this ukulele. And sure enough, a company called Knickerbocker Toys saw it, thought it was really good. And when she got to Toy Fair in March, there was her identical toy in the identical box being sold for less than they had priced it at Toy Fair. And she called Elliot. Toy Fair is always in New York. She called Elliot back in Los Angeles, absolutely in a panic. They couldn't figure out how to bring the price down on that ukulele because they made a beautiful box, beautiful instrument. And they took a beating. They took a financial beating. She had to ask her family to get money to keep the company afloat. But Harold Matson couldn't handle the stress. And he said, just give me my $10,000 back. I'm out of here. And so he didn't last very long at Mattel, but it still carries his name. Anyway, without Harold, it was Elliot and Ruth, and they were a very dynamic couple. She didn't make the same mistake again, of course. Everything was unveiled at Toy Fair. Now we're up to the 1950s, and she has her eye on making this company the biggest toy company in the world. They were, at that point, just about the smallest toy company in the world. So she was someone who always thought big and always took risks. In the early 1950s, they were the development part of the company was what Elliot ran. He and the men, and it was all men, were the ones who came up with the ideas. And he loved toys. He loved musical toys, and they did have a line, the Jack in the Box. Some of you might remember that you crank. He created the crank mechanism. They put that in other toys, the cowboy guitar, other things. But mostly the men were coming up in the early 1950s, when you might remember there were a lot of cowboy shows, Western shows on TV. So they were making guns. They had very realistic toy guns in those days. So realistic when Ruth went to bring the Remington repeating rifle to the Remington company to show it to them, and she brought the rifle out, the CEO ducked under the desk. He actually thought it might be a real gun. So they were making these wonderful guns, which of course today probably they couldn't make any gun. They probably don't make any guns. I don't know. And they were making rockets, space toys. They really weren't in the doll market because they developed certain values with Mattel, Ruth and Elliot. One value was we won't go into any area of toys where we can't be unique. And there were already plenty of dolls out there, baby dolls, almost exclusively, because little girls, it was 1950s, and little girls are being trained to be what their mothers were, which was homemakers and taking care of the baby. So, but Ruth had been watching her own daughter play with paper dolls. And paper dolls, raise your hand if you remember the frustration of paper dolls. You had to put their clothes on with little paper tabs, and it was a nightmare. But they were adult women, and you could get paper dolls who had all kinds of backstories, and I remember loving them. And her daughter, as a 13, 14-year-old, really loved them. And Ruth kept watching her and thinking, these little girls want to play at being adults. They want to play at being big girls. And that was her story, too, to go back to where we started. She was a little girl who was in a hurry to grow up. And so this thought got planted in her head. Meanwhile, she took a huge risk that leapfrogged Mattel in the toy business. In a new TV show was going to come on in the early 50s, and they were going to sell advertising in a new way. There would be ads every 15 minutes, and you could buy an ad, but it had to be for the whole year. Now, toys were not sold on television at that time. The way toys were sold was through catalogs, particularly the Sears catalog. And so parents would give their children, I remember this, the Sears catalog, and say, oh, go ahead, look through the catalog and tell us what you think you might want. And guess who was in charge? The parents. But Ruth had this idea that they could do a lot better if they tried selling on television. So her public relations team came to her and they said, there's this new show. We don't know how it'll do, but we think it might be a good show to advertise on. It's aimed at children, but it'll cost you $500,000 for a year of advertising every week on this show. Now, all of Mattel was valued at $500,000 at that time. And her head of finance came in and she said, will we go out of business if we do this and we're wrong? And he said, well, I don't know if you'll be broken, but you'll be badly bent. Nevertheless, she said, let's do it. And so they created an ad for, again, a gun. It was called the burp gun. It made a burping noise. And they made a beautiful ad for this gun. And they put it on this new show, which I don't know if any of you have guessed yet what show it is. I know you're all muted, but the show was the Mickey Mouse Club. Of course, it was wildly popular. And the gun ended up doing extremely well. It sold out so fast that President Eisenhower, who wanted one for his grandson, couldn't get one. And Ruth had to take one that was broken and get it all fixed so she could send it to the president. So the burp gun did great advertising. She beat all the other companies to advertising. And this really made Mattel blossom in the 1950s. By 1959, Mattel was a $100 million company. And by 1959, Ruth had figured out what to do with that idea about making an adult doll for little girls. It took her years because every time she went to Elliott, every time she went to the design team, they said, Ruth, you're great at running the company, but mothers will never buy their daughters a doll with breasts. So just go back to doing what you do well. We make the toys, you run the company, it's all working, Ruth. But she couldn't give up on this idea. And one day the family took a family trip to Europe. She had 2 children by then, and one was named Barbara. And her son was named Ken, for those of you who don't know. This is where she got the names for the dolls. But they were in Luzerne, Switzerland, and in the window of a toy shop, famous toy shop, she sees a doll that you would think was a Barbie doll. But it was not. It was a doll that had started life as a cartoon character in a German newspaper. The Bild Zeitung was the newspaper. And this character was called Lily. And Lily was basically a prostitute. She would trade favors for favors with men for dresses, jewelry, this kind of thing. And the cartoonist, she was an extremely popular cartoon. And the cartoonist thought it'd be fun to have a gag sex toy for men in a doll form of Lily. And so he made this thing, and men would buy it and hang it from their rearview mirrors, give it out at bachelor parties. But it was Europe, where they're a little less uptight than we are here in the States in the 50s. And the doll works its way into toy stores because little girls would see it and say, we want to play with that. So this is the doll that Ruth sees. It's a 12-inch doll, again, body just like a Barbie, a little more sexy looking. The eyes were turned up. She had sort of a sideways look that she was giving. Basically, though, you would think it was a Barbie doll because Ruth bought 3 of those dolls, brought them back to her engineer, head of the department that manufactured toys, and said, go to Japan. That's where we were making things after the war, cheaply. Go to Japan, where they're really good with plastics, and make this doll for me. This is the doll. This is what I want to sell. Well, of course, they all still thought she was crazy. But Jack Ryan took the doll to Japan, started manufacturing, figuring out the manufacturing. It's quite hard in those days to make very finely detailed plastics. But he found a company that could do it. Meanwhile, she hired out of the Fashion Institute in LA a woman to make the clothes. And she said, I want these clothes to be perfect. I want little zippers and little buttons and couture looking clothes. And you're going to go live in Japan for a year and make these and figure out how to source the material and get the clothes made. So she had that going on. But Toy Fair, the doll was going to be unveiled at Toy Fair in March 1959. And Ruth heard the men when they said, mothers will not buy this toy. And so she had an idea. You've all heard of Mad Men. Maybe some of you watched the show. It's in the 1950s. The original madman was a man named Ernest Dichter. Ernest Dichter had studied with Freud, and then he came to this country before the war. And he founded a psychology business, not by working with individuals, but by targeting companies. And we have him to thank for the psychological selling of goods. So he went to a lipstick company and said, reshape your lipstick containers to look phallic, and this will get you more customers. Or to the car company, take your Mustang, your new Mustang convertible, and put a beautiful scantily clad woman in it. Appeal to the psychological side of your customers. This was a totally new idea. An entire book called The Hidden Persuaders was written, focusing on Ernest Dichter as the evil genius behind this change in advertising. And he also had the first focus groups in the country. So that's how he would figure out how to position a product. Ruth, in her forward-thinking way, went to Ernest Dichter and said, I have two things I need you to research for me. One is a gun that shoots that sounds very realistic when you shoot it. The caps really sound like a gunshot. I need you to see how that goes over in a focus group. And the other, I know, horrifying today, right? The other is this doll. We're calling it the Barbie doll after my daughter. But I want to know, how do we get past mothers not wanting to buy a daughter? Their daughter's a doll with breasts. So this, as I said in the beginning, when I got to go in the Mattel archives, I thought they must have a copy of Dichter's report. And sure enough, I found it. Was able to give it to the head of the Barbie brand, which was very fun. She was very excited, very fun to read. And sure enough, the men were right. When the mothers were given this doll, they said, oh my gosh, we'd never give our daughters. Look at the breasts on this doll. No way. But the daughters love the doll. They absolutely love the doll. And so Dichter came up with the idea, we'll give the doll a story. The story is she's a teenage fashion model, and you can teach your daughters good grooming if you get them this doll. Because after all, models have to have good grooming, nice clothes. And so that was the tack they took when they created that. And you can watch it on your computers. The first Barbie ad, you just Google the first Barbie advertisement. Some of you may remember it. I won't attempt to sing the song because I'm terrible. But the ad treats the doll as if she's real. And you are joining in her life. It's still today a very compelling ad. So Ruth is all ready. She goes to Toy Fair. Now they have many rooms at Toy Fair, Mattel. Her Barbie room is spectacular. There are, I think, 21 original outfits. And she has the bridal outfit up on a pedestal with a huge long staircase. It's all gorgeous. And the buyers come in. And almost no one orders a doll. The buyer from Sears orders no dolls, and they're the biggest buyer. And Elliot told me, he said, I'd never seen Ruth cry, but she came back to the hotel room to call Japan and halt production because she was going to have a lot of excess inventory. And he said she was crying. And then a couple months go by, May, June. Oh, the ads are running on television. Little girls get out of school, and suddenly there is a run on Barbie dolls. And by the end of that year, they sold 300,000 dolls. It was a phenomena from that year right up until this one. 3 Barbie dolls are sold every second. That number's probably wrong since the movie. My guess is it has certainly gone up. Everywhere in the world except the countries that don't allow it, and there are a couple of them. Mattel stock, if you owned it in the 1960s, you would have had double-digit returns every year. They were flying as high as you could fly. By the end of the 1960s, early 70s, there was a movement in corporations like Mattel to buy up other corporations. And so Ruth brought in someone from Litton Industries, who was sort of a master of this, and they started buying other companies. They bought Ringling Brothers Circus. They bought a company that made playground equipment. And other companies were sort of adjacent to the toy business. But there was a problem. They were buying these companies with Mattel stock. And there were a series of incidents, a fire at a factory in Mexico, some trucks that went missing, and the value of the company, the income of the company went down, which would have brought the stock price down. But Ruth and these other executives hid that fact using a scheme called bill and hold. And I don't know how many people here are in business, but it was something that was commonly used at the time. Bill and hold would be if I call you up and say, oh, you've been such a great customer, we're going to bill you for 100,000 units of whatever, toy car, but we're not going to actually produce them and you won't have to pay us. We just want it on the books that we have that. Now, this kind of scheme worked on and off over the years because something like a fire in a factory could be made up in the next quarter. But this time it wasn't. And they got caught, and Ruth got caught. Elliot was not involved. It was right at the time in the early 70s, 72, when she also got breast cancer. And she had a mastectomy. Now, again, I don't know how many of you remember this, but in the 70s, if you got breast cancer, it was your fault. You did not tell anyone. You felt ashamed, and you were made to, the culture made you feel ashamed. So these things were happening at the same time. She was being investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. She got the breast cancer. Her world really fell apart. And then the board kicked her out. Her and Elliot kicked them out of the company they founded. I've done a lot of research on founders of companies, and I can tell you that for them, this is the equivalent of having their firstborn child taken away, as you can imagine with what I've just told you about her story. She went into a terrible depression. Elliot was a painter. He loved painting, and he was fine, actually. And he said, I told her to take up painting, but she didn't want to take up painting. She spent a lot of time at Gardena, which is a big poker room and casino here in Los Angeles. It's still there. She'd drive up in her pink Cadillac, and she'd gamble like her father. She was a great gambler in business and in real life. But that, of course, wasn't enough for her. And she realized she couldn't turn off that entrepreneurial head. And with the breast cancer and losing her breast, she always wore couture clothes. And by the way, she was quite busty. So she went to get a prosthetic. Well, in the 70s, the early prosthetics were just a lump. Like, imagine sort of a lump of material. She would stick into your bra and it looked completely misshapen, and you couldn't wear anything nice. You basically wore tent dresses. So Ruth had an idea. She did some research. She saw how many women were expected to have breast cancer, which was a lot. And she said, women want real prosthetics. And she brought in someone from Mattel, who was a friend of hers, because they had material they made baby dolls was very soft and pliable. And she worked with them. She developed a realistic prosthetic. She had rights and lefts. She had different sizes. And she went into the top stores, Neiman Marcus, Bloomingdale's, and she said to them, I'll let you sell my product. Oh, and by the way, she called the company, are you ready? Ruthton, Ruthton. Horrible name. However, this time she was going to get her name in the company. And the product was called Nearly Me, which is what people ended up calling the company, because Ruthton was such a bad name. Anyway, she would go into any company where she was going to sell, and she started at the top. And she'd say, I will not let you set up my salon. You have to set up a separate salon for mastectomies. That's what she called women who'd had mastectomies. And the mastectomies will come in, and you'll have a beautiful salon for them. And everyone will be trained in how to treat them, because I was treated so badly when I went to get a prosthetic. And then we're going to have a meeting of your entire staff, from stock boys to the CEO. You'd better be there. And I'm going to explain this product. And she would go into this meeting. She'd explain the product. And at some point, she would grab one of the men, grab their hand, pull them to her, slap their hand on her breast, and say, see if you can tell which is the fake one. She did the same thing, even more. She went on, pretty sure it was the Merv Griffin show, as she became known for this product. And she literally opened her blouse on television and said, see if you can tell which is the fake one. So it gives you some idea of what her character was like. Nearly Me, Ruthton really consumed her in these years of the 1980s, when she was out of the company, when she ended up pleading nolo contendere. She did her community service for what had happened at Mattel. And this was what she threw herself into in the 1980s. She would go to these salons and personally fit the women. And I actually, for the first time in the 13 years the book has been out, met a woman here in Ojai, where I live, who had been fitted by Ruth for a prosthetic. Ruth said it was an experience like nothing she'd ever had in her life. And I read the letters from women who she fitted, who said, you saved me. I felt so horrible about myself. With your prosthetics, I could wear real clothes again. And Ruth describes feeling a kind of happiness that she'd never known, because she really didn't have women friends. She worked in an entirely male world, and she just didn't connect with women. She even said, I don't like talking about children. It's not what I'm interested in. And so she found it hard to connect. But here, toward the end of her life, she finds this connection with women. She ended up selling Ruthton in the 1990s because her son, Ken, got AIDS. He was a closet homosexual. It was greatly ironic, of course, because there was this feeling in the male gay community that Ken was gay. And it turned out that his namesake was actually gay. And Ken died in 1992. We all can imagine what a horrible blow that was. Ruth wrote her autobiography at that time, then in the next few years. And by 1995, 96, Jill Barad had come in to run Mattel. She was the first woman to run Mattel since Ruth, and the Barbie brand wasn't doing so well. And she called up Ruth and she said, why don't you come back into the company? I need you. Let's go around the world and talk about Barbie. And I've spoken to Jill. She said what she didn't realize was what a rock star Ruth Handler was. Because, of course, by the 90s, there was a collector's community. There were adult women and men who had played with Barbies when they were children. and they were now collecting. And there's a huge collecting community around the world. Everywhere they went, Jill told me they were just besieged, lines out the door to have Ruth's autobiography signed. And at the 40th anniversary of Barbie Ruth in 1999, Ruth was sitting at the head table. And she had come back to this company and this product and this world that she'd been kicked out of, but she had found redemption. And she always said the happiness she found in making the prosthetics was a kind of happiness she'd never experienced. So I guess it's a lesson in not just falling from grace and redemption, but also in the way that doors open, even when other doors close, as we say. She ended up dying of cancer in 2002. And Elliot died, I forget what year, but fairly recently. But as we know, her legacy lives on, even in the form of the Ruth Handler being portrayed in the Barbie movie, which was quite a surprise to me, but I'm very, very happy about it. So Barbie and Ruth the biography is also been under option for quite a while. So we're hoping we might get a movie or a full movie just for Ruth, or maybe a limited series or something like that. So wish me luck on that. I love this. I'll show you a couple of pictures. I love this picture of her. You know, she's quite young and she's just, this was one of I think that was they did make the Chatty Cathy doll. That might be, and they also they did have a baby doll, but it did something that no other baby doll did. And then that was you could see the cowboy guitar. Here's her and Elliot. I love these young pictures of her. And she was so incredibly ahead of her time, of course. Let me just show you a couple more here. This is, maybe some of you have seen some of these, but here she is. Imagine, in the 1950s, when almost every other woman that you know is home cooking, baking, and taking care of their kids, and you're building what you hope will be a multi-million-dollar company. So why don't I stop there? I'll just show you you all probably remember, but this is, of course, our original Barbie. They sold her very cheaply because they had a razor and razor blade theory. You sell the razor cheaply, but you're going to sell a whole lot of blades.
Right.
That was the theory with the doll and the clothes. Okay, you probably have a few questions.
Okay, I'm going to bring everybody up, and I can't tell if anybody's got their hand up, so I'm going to actually start with my own question.
Okay.
So the first Barbie, what year was that, did you say?
1959. So
1959. Yeah. Okay. So, I told you my story. My first Barbie was a paper doll, and then I graduated to a real Barbie doll. But somewhere along the line, so I'm guessing it was the mid-60s, maybe early to mid-60s, I ended up with a Barbie that had 3 wigs. Does that ring a bell at all? She was a redhead, a brunette, and a blonde. And of course, her head was smooth, and you could change her wigs along with her clothes.
I don't remember that one.
Oh, gosh. I wish I'd held on to it, but I didn't keep it.
Yeah, well, everyone says that, but the truth is, unless you really have a pristine doll, now that I've gotten to know the collectors.
Yeah.
It really
didn't play with the dolls, right? They just stored them. Yeah. Okay, Michelle, I saw you had your hand up, so go ahead.
Hey, that was the fashion queen Barbie, because I have her.
Oh no!
She's in a gold and white striped strapless swimsuit.
Yeah.
And the wigs are down. Yeah, I'm a Barbie collector. I've got 450 plus Barbies.
Oh my gosh.
Do you have the 60th anniversary book?
No, I don't have that, unfortunately.
Oh, because it has I interviewed collectors all over the world. It was really fascinating.
Yeah, I've been to the Barbie convention. I've done the whole thing. Yeah.
Great.
Wow. Okay, Steve, you've got your hand up. Go ahead. But you got to unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay. Interesting story about her success in business, but she graduated from my high school, East High School in Denver, Colorado. And one of my high school graduation partners was her niece. So it was always Aunt Ruth. Her maiden name was Moscow,
Yes.
but she grew up in Denver and went to East High School. And she's on the Rogues Gallery of photos in the hallway at the school, along with Sidney Sheldon and Don Cheadle and other famous people who also graduated from East High School. That's where Ruth was from.
Wow, that's great. And so you grew up in it, was it a Jewish neighborhood that fed that high school?
No, but it was an important high school at the time. They've built other high schools since, but that was an important school. And I guess it wasn't all Jewish, but it was relatively important for the times.
Mhm.
I don't know what year she graduated because I graduated much later. But she
Right.
graduated from East High School.
Yeah. She was born in 1916, so she probably graduated about 32 or so.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Well, thanks. That's interesting.
So what happened to the daughter, the namesake for the doll? What happened to Barbara?
You know, I feel badly about Barbara in that she's still around. She's actually the only one left because, as I said, Ken died. She was, sometimes you're just born into the wrong family. And she wanted her mom to stay home and bake cookies.
Mhm.
When I first tried to interview her, she said, "I don't know why you'd be writing a book about my mother." She really did not like the idea that she didn't have a mother like all the other girls had in the 1950s. She never really had a career, from what I can tell. But of course, she was very, very well off.
Right.
She has been a bit more visible because she did give them her sanction for the movie, apparently. So, and I did eventually interview her. So, and you can buy Ruth. Let me just say, it is very available now on Amazon.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm curious how many people on this program today have seen the new Barbie movie, because I'm one of the few people who have not. All the hands are up. Okay, yeah. I know. I need to get there. I need to see it. My daughter just watched it last weekend and she loved it. Is everybody a big fan of it? No. Okay, Michelle, tell us what you think.
Well, there's someone else on the call that I've had a longer conversation with, but I just didn't see the point of it. The only thing I enjoyed about it was looking for the dolls, the outfits and the dolls that I have in my collection. But beyond that, I did not enjoy it. I thought the plot was stupid. I thought the adult jokes were unnecessary. But I have learned that I am in the minority about this.
Yeah. Well, the new CEO of Mattel, relatively new CEO of Mattel, had the idea that rather than trying to come up with the next brilliant toy, they should exploit the brands that they have. And Barbie, of course, is the biggest brand. And I think that really was how the movie was born. And then they put together a package that would look very attractive, hiring big name writers, directors, all of that. And of course, very big name stars. I don't completely disagree with you on the plot. By the second half, I was completely lost when they go to the real world. But I think Greta Gerwig just wanted to hit certain beats about women and men and make them funny in the way that she does. And they kind of counted on people loving Barbie like you do and coming to see it. And they bet right.
Yeah, it's been hugely successful.
Huge.
Well, my hairstylist said it was the most affordable commercial that Mattel could have made to reignite interest in Barbie. But they had, from what I remember, they had over 100 corporate partnerships in terms of products. They had exclusives for every different movie theater. And they also And instead of featuring the dolls from the past so that people like me with duplicates might be able to sell them, they came up with 16 new dolls so that they generated a whole new market for Barbie with people who are now just wanting to collect the 16 from the movie.
Well, they never do leave you collectors alone, do they? I got to go inside the brand and see how they were developing new dolls, and there's just no end to what's going to come, and lots of it is aimed at that collector community, as you know, and some very expensive dolls are out there.
Lee, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, both. I just purchased the first Barbie for my granddaughter, who is going to be 7 in a couple of months. And that seems to me about the right age, because she's tired of her baby dolls by now. But one of the dolls I purchased was a mermaid, which was very new to me. And I was curious about what you thought about this kind of Barbie presentation.
I think, I like to say I'm not a Barbie expert, I'm a Ruth expert, but having talked to the people inside the brand, like any other company, they're just seeking ways to make this product continue to sell. And, when little girls ask for a boyfriend for Barbie, Ken was born. And then, they say, well, she should have a sister or a cousin. And then we get Midge and we get all these other dolls. I don't think Ruth's original idea did not envision professions. So that was a whole other tangent that the company went off on that really, I think, was more selling to the adults who would buy the dolls for their child. I mean, if I went to my daughter at 7 and said, would you like a biology Barbie? A biologist Barbie? She would have said, a what? Right? She didn't care. And mostly, I think what we know is that when they get these profession-specific dolls, the astronaut or, librarian, whatever, with the little accoutrements that go with whatever the doll is, briefcase, the businesswoman Barbie, that they take all that stuff apart and it gets lost in all the other toys and everything. So but I think it's a selling point to have the professions. So I would say the mermaid, probably capitalizing on Little Mermaid in some way. It's always good to remember that the Barbie doll is a product of a major company. That's what the doll is, a product.
Yeah.
So we
But
still love her with
she loves
Barbie.
mermaids. That's why I chose that of one of several.
Yeah. Well, the Little Mermaid movie, I think, reignited interest in mermaids. And my granddaughter also, who's 6, loves mermaids. Yeah. But then next week she'll be loving something else.
So, Robin, you have a couple of comments too. Laurel said, fabulous presentation. I learned so much. Jan says, thanks, very interesting. And Vicky says she loves the movie and has seen it twice and bought the DVD. So got a big fan.
Yeah, great. Well, like I said, I certainly hope that the book will make it into at least a mini series, if not a movie.
Wasn't there a documentary though at some point that was done?
There's a documentary on the doll.
Okay.
There's yet to be anything really just on Ruth. And as you heard, she has such an interesting dramatic.
Yeah.
So we kind of can't explain why it hasn't been picked up, but Hollywood's a crazy place.
It's only a matter of time.
I keep saying.
Okay, if nobody else has anything to add, I want to thank Robin very, very much. This was really interesting, and thank you for so generously sharing your expertise and your research and your insight. It's really wonderful, and it's a great addition to our programming mix here. So thank you.
I'm so glad. Thank you, Laura, and thanks everyone.
Thanks for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Okay.